Neurips 2024, Part 12. Memorize what matters. Emergent scene decomposition from Multitraverse, Marco Pavone et al. This is a paper that deals with static versus ephemeral scenes. So if you have a self-driving car, you want to be able to differentiate between what's static and what's not static. So therefore, you can prioritize your algorithms towards the non-static stuff. In other words, you have, let's say you drive to work every day, you have a sense for what is there all the time, the buildings, the street signs, and then you have a sense, of course, for pedestrians and animals and debris and things like that, which is ephemeral. So that's the goal of this paper. And to my understanding, this has been a not so well understood problem so far, and I'd be curious to know how Tesla is dealing with this problem. But what the authors are saying is that you have several approaches towards this problem, and one of them is you can just train a model with supervision. You can say, this is a house, this is static, this is not static. Of course, that is not scalable, particularly not for something like Tesla. I have a sense for potentially that's what Waymo did. That's why they have geofencing, right? Because they focus on areas, on cities, and there they map them out. So you have sort of a high definition map, if you will, and then you drive, and then you know what's supposed to be in the map, and whatever is not supposed to be in the map, that is ephemeral, and therefore you have to pay attention. Now, this paper ties really nicely into this paper we just discussed before, which was pose estimation. And the reason this is, of course, it's almost a transition is once we identify ephemeral objects, we want to also know their pose estimation. In other words, we want to predict what they're going to do. Whether a dog is facing forward or backward makes a difference in terms of what the animal is going to do, although it could also walk backwards. The same for pedestrians, but we assume they're going to walk forward. So if a person is turned with their back towards the road, we might have a good sense for what that they're not going to be a danger for us. There's no danger for us to transact with pedestrians. So things like that, just as a tangent. But let's get back to this paper. So the goal here is self-supervised learning. So this is end-to-end learning, because what the authors are doing is they're taking a 2D image from the camera. They determine the features of the image using something called structure from motion. Then they do Gaussian splatting. So they turn this feature space into point clouds with learnable parameters such as mean, variance, photometric information, and they learn that. That's the key. So you can learn those parameters, and therefore you can have a learnable feature space representation of where you're driving. And this is unsupervised. So you now drive and drive and drive. And the more you drive, in the ablation study, they make it very clear that the more transactions you have in the same road, the better the understanding of the static nature. And you can also learn what's not static based on this Gaussian splatting. In other words, you have certain points that seem to be the same all the time, and then you have points that aren't the same. And with appropriate loss function, you can identify the outliers and the inliers being static stuff that is always there, and the outlier being the ephemeral stuff. And therefore, when you drive to focus on, let the inliers be the inliers. You know what to do. You focus on the outliers, which is ephemeral, and then you deal with, let's say, pose estimation and things like, maybe we discussed also the physics, the Kaiming-He paper, where we try to understand physics from 2D images. So these papers are all related, right? What we're talking about here is really, we want to have an end-to-end algorithm that understands what is going on in the image, that understands the semantics of that particular ephemeral object. What is it? A dog. We want to understand how its pose estimation is. So we want to be able to predict what that dog might be doing next, and that's all going into our planning algorithm. So this is the goal. And that's why I think these papers, this is very important for Neurips in general, to understand where do we stand in the modeling algorithmic space when it comes to robotics. And I think whether it's this Pavone paper, the Peterbilt paper about pose estimation, the Cunningham paper, or the Persilian paper, which is the idea there was to understand sort of intent, or to even have a good sense, a foundation model for understanding what an object actually will do and how to plan. Famous example there was, if you want to instruct a robot to fill a glass with water, the robot needs to understand that the glass is upside down and first turn the glass around. For that, it has to have a pose estimation. It has to have semantic understanding of what it means to be upside down. So now we're back to this paper. What this paper is doing is really a mapping. If you want, it's a end-to-end SLAM type approach where you're just trying to map the street while you're in a learnable way. This is key. It's self-supervised, learnable, so therefore it's scalable. And I think that's where all these papers are going. It's scalability, it's self-supervision, because we don't want to have to annotate stuff. We also want to be flexible enough for changes. Now, they're already saying that that's one of the shortcomings, right? If you have if you drive down a street, let's say 10 or 20 times, and you kind of have a sense for the static nature of that street, you then the question, of course, comes up, okay, are you now tying this to a map, or are you memorizing this? And I think at least the way I understand it is, this is not mapped, this is memorized. So you approach a street and you tie it to your let's say some sort of foundation model that allows to understand, okay, this is where I am. So I remember this is kind of similar to ChatGPT. You put a prompt of a Shakespeare poem, and it remembers that Shakespeare because it has that in its representation. That's the way. So there's no mapping here, because what you don't want is this discrepancy between the map and what you see. So you see something, you remember what you see, you also remember what it is that you can disregard, and therefore you focus on the ephemeral objects, and then you can do pose estimation to further go. So I think that's roughly what this paper is about. There's some engineering in there, such as the Gaussian splatting. There's some dimensionality analysis. So in the ablation study, I think the ablation study is pretty straightforward. So the more dimension you have in the features, so basically the more features you have, corners, shades, intensity of light, the more you have, the more you train your model based on these parameters, the better your the section between ephemeral and static, the better resolution, of course. That means more pixels, more training, and more memory, the better also the dissection. I think to summarize, this paper is, in my opinion, it's one of those things that that might seem pretty obvious for most people, and maybe also not so interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, duh, you just drive down the road, you realize what's static and what's not. You might even be able to hack this just by maybe even do one-shot learning, right? You could have a visual transformer that can, maybe semantically understand what is a static picture, what is a static object. Is there a latent space representation of a static object? For example, something that doesn't move. But you could have static objects that move too, like, for example, flags on flagpoles. So there's a philosophical question: what is actually a static object versus an ephemeral object? Now, in the simple case, in most cases, it is simply a building is static and a pedestrian is not static. But how do we deal with construction sites? I think that's where things become really interesting. So a construction site in this case would be an ephemeral object because it's not there typically, but then it's not moving either because it's static. And in my opinion, that is a pretty interesting problem that this paper doesn't really address because, and that's what they're saying, big changes. I mean, if there's a fire in LA and all of a sudden your road looks different because there's no houses, what do you do? So they do mention, though, the visual transformer. And I want to just say this as a tangent. I think there's a way to potentially hack this static versus ephemeral problem the same way we humans do it, right? I always think that if I drop you down in the Amazon jungle or in a place or in the Antarctic, well, that's a bad example, but somewhere where there's a lot of movement and a lot of static stuff at the same time, you will have a pretty quick understanding of what is static and what is moving. And I feel like that's because we have a very good sense, right? We humans have an incredibly good sense for what is moving because we needed to have that in order to survive tiger attacks back in the Stone Age. So therefore, or cats, I mean, my cat is incredibly good at understanding movement. So changes in the environment, danger, we even have it like when we're in a bar and somebody looks at us, we almost feel like we have eyes in our back. We understand somebody's focusing on us. So we have these we have this uncanny ability to understand unusual situations. And I think in self-driving, that's probably the holy grail. Well, we're not even looking for static versus ephemeral. We're more looking for unusual. In other words, I could have a bike on the side moving, but that, moving in a normal way. But then we have, let's say, these new electric bikes. They're much faster than normal bikes. So it's very unusual and therefore more difficult to navigate. We could have a, maybe mentally deranged person on the sidewalk walking weirdly versus people just walking normally. So maybe the real question, in my opinion, is not so much what's ephemeral and what's static, but it's more like what's to be expected. So can we have high confidence intervals in the in what's going to explain? I always said that, for example, also in self-driving, right? If my Tesla picks up my child from the school, it has to have a better understanding of a schoolyard because the schoolyard is unpredictable. There's young kids, they do unpredictable stuff unless you understand that the schoolyard in itself has predictability. So, for example, kids playing with balls, so that's more likely to happen. So you pay attention to that, and that in itself becomes an expected event. Versus if you're next to a church, you might not have that, right? So those are the kinds of philosophical questions. This paper goes into that direction. It's a beginning, I think. Again, the engineering is very interesting. Gaussian splatting, structure from motion, things along those lines that help dissect the image into segments which then are parameterized and learnable. And that is, to me, that's the path towards end-to-end learning, which is the holy grail because that is scalable. Thank you.